is up, theology nerds? This is Trip. And you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you interviews with some of the most amazing thinkers to put in your earbuds so you can blow your mind peace with creative thoughts, inspiring faithful living for a more just world. And today I'm joined by a friend of mine, repeat guest of the podcast, and he is a part of our current online group, Oh God, What Now? Christianity 20 Years After 9/11. That's right, it's Brian McLaren. And we are tackling questions sent to us by members of the group, these people that went to ohgodwhatnow.net, signed up, joined up. They get 6 weeks of exciting interaction. That is 6 sessions with a mini lecture, followed by Diana Butler Bass, Brian McLaren, and I discussing it. And then a number of Q&A sessions, like this one, where Brian joins to hop on. Next week, Diana joins and hops on and answers questions you all, members of the class, have sent in. In this session, we're going to talk about authoritarianism, fascism, a gospel or account of Christianity that moves beyond fear, the relationship of culture, the religious right and power, politics. What does fidelity look like in the early church? How do we deal with racism, structural, and then what is it like to create communities that respond to it with faithfulness? These are just some of the topics that we get to, along with a fun reference to Frodo Baggins. That's right. If you enjoy this, want to submit your own question and get access to the lectures that inspired them, go to ohgodwhatnow.net and you can be part of the over 1,700 people that have joined this online group. You can even meet them in the Facebook group if you choose to join that. So yeah, without further ado, this is Brian McLaren and me talking about your questions. Come join the group. And remember tomorrow, very special episode with Army Chaplain Josh Morris, looking at moral injury to soldiers in the war on terror. It's a doozy. Get ready. Here you go. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I am here with Brian McLaren for some fun Q&A in response to the first 2 sessions of the Oh God, What Now? Christianity 20 Years After 9/11 group. Now, we've gotten a host of questions, both in audio and in text and emails, and I've been pulling them together and organizing them around themes. So even if your exact question doesn't come up, hopefully they've been blocked off in ways all the topics come up. I got some now I'll talk about with Brian. Next week, Diana's joining. We'll do the same thing. So just keep them coming. But this week is getting real close to the anniversary of 9/11, Brian. And you just got back from, you and Diana were both at Wild Goose, and I was very jealous. As we're getting near the anniversary and more conversations are taking place about it, have there been any new thoughts or emotions or things that came up that you really weren't anticipating?
Well, that's a great question. Obviously the fall of Kabul and the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban brings up a whole lot of issues that relate to America's status in the world, and gosh, there's so much we could talk about that. Could I do one little riff on that?
Yeah.
Because I was a lit major, and when you're a lit major, you read an awful lot of British literature. There's this kind of trope that really goes from the very beginning of the U.S. until the 20th century, which is that Americans are uneducated, semi-barbarous hucksters who just want to make a buck, and they don't have anything in the way of fine culture and sophisticated thought. They're just a bunch of kind of bumpkin, hillbilly, cowboy, this sort of amalgam of not very smart people. And it seems to me that because the U.S. performed so strongly and heroically in World War II. The European narrative about Americans, it seems to me, had a big change in World War II. And Americans were seen by many around the world as saviors in World War II. And I think Americans really liked having that self-image. I was born in 1956, so just, 10, 11 years after World War II ended, when all of that was in the ascendancy. So my entire life has been, or the first half of my life was in this period of Americans were great and all the rest. But my gosh, the election of Donald Trump sure hit hard on that. When people around the world just said, "How in the world could America do this?" And then I think people were hoping that under Biden, America would be the savior again, and would get back its tarnished image. And I just think one of the things that the fall of Afghanistan, with all of its tragedy, does is it helps us say, look, it's this message of humility for Americans, that, our hubris and thinking we can do nation building, thinking that we can shortcut history by, with American technology or politics or money or whatever. I think, that's been humbling. So that's something really worth bringing up. The other thing that's come to mind in the last week or two, we've just been breaking record after record with climate change. Mm-hmm. And, there's something similar here. America having, to achieve our wealth and prosperity, we burned an awful lot of coal and oil, and we continue to do so. And I guess we're right up there near the top, if we aren't at the top, for the amount of carbon that the United States has put into the atmosphere. And so I just think we're in the middle of I guess it's kind of like an addict goes through when they hit bottom. They have to say, I cherish this inflated idea of myself, but my life has become unmanageable, and I need to be restored to sanity. So that's probably the main thing that's been. And of course, if we add race to that discussion, it intensifies even more, because America could develop this savior mentality only by bracketing its deeply entrenched white supremacy and racism. And so obviously the events of the last couple of years puncture that, self-deception as well.
Yeah. No, I think that's, those are all important things to keep in mind. And I think that's one of the benefits of spending this much time looking at a short time period, because it's like when you get to go on a long enough retreat, that the immediate pressures and anxieties you take to the retreat dissipate. Yes. And then you realize, like, oh, like right now, like my wife and I've got the first break we've had in 2 years, because my parents finally got to visit. And we realized we had not had 2 hours of a conversation together since we moved here, without children nearby, a pandemic going on, trying to figure out homeschooling. Right? And things were really weird for a second. I was like, knowing our personality difference, I'm like, why don't you just go ahead and vent for a little bit? Right. And says everything. And then we have like the most fun we've had in a long time. And I think that a time like this, when you go on spiritual retreats, you have that time where whatever seems like in the immediate stops having a kind of tyranny over your imagination, and you look. Yes. And I hope that this is a moment for followers of Jesus to do the same. There are things we need to acknowledge. There are things we need to repent for. There's fidelity that we need to really strive for more. And if we let all those immediate things determine us, we'll just be in response mode and fear of failure and anxiety and decline. And then we'll be embarrassed 20 years from now that we didn't do anything.
I'm glad you bring up the Christian dimension of this, because everything I said, a couple minutes ago was just about the political dimension of it. But this humbling of white America establishment in America, it's inseparable, isn't it, from a humbling of the Christian religion. Mm-hmm. So much we could talk about there. And of course, I think any religion, including the Christian religion, will be better off humble as opposed to proud. So that's a blessing. I think I used to preach that the most repeated phrase or little saying in the Bible is that God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. So I passed that on, having heard it from someone else, and I never actually went to count. And I guess do not fear is another big one. Put those two together, you got a good combination.
Mm-hmm. Well, that actually connects with one of the first questions. And this one's a longer one, but I couldn't figure out how to edit it significantly. It's from Farmer John, who said, I couldn't attend Wild Goose this year. I missed you. I missed all of us next year. I had a thought in 2001 about the 9/11 attack. They attacked the USA's commerce and capitalistic system by attacking the symbol of the Twin Towers. A very clear message, if you ask me. They attacked the military machine in Pax Americana by attacking the Pentagon. They wanted to attack the government that oversaw, allowed, and profited from the economic system and military might. The fourth plan would have hit the Congress or the White House. They did not attack the church. For religious zealots, they did not target a competing religion. I'm no expert, but my thought has always been that it was because the church didn't pose a threat to them. They didn't think they saw us as meaningful in the world of oppressors. I think it was a statement of our current decline. I can see clearly how some parts of our current national Christian experience is the empire religion. I can see how even my liberal Christian faction finds itself a supporter of the powerful, less as a prophetic voice sometimes too. I can see how we Christians retreat to piety as the only arena we can have a meaningful statement in society. We don't seem to be able to point to injustice or demand peaceful and loving responses from the economic system, from the military complex, and from the government. Well, William Barber is an exception, but one that proves the point. The people who wanted to tear down America and send it a message didn't send the message to the church. They didn't see any power there, not a factor in their oppression narrative. I think it shows how weak we are as a voice in our society. Our enemies don't take us seriously. I'm not sure I'll be able to change the status or change the tide. It seems inevitable to me. The church declining in attendance practice for 50 years. Personally, it breaks my heart because I love the church. I go and I'm on vacation away from my home, and I like it. I'm part of a newer-ish, smaller church that meets under new parameters, and I'm willing to hope for societal influence in a different way in the future. The next 50 years, if we're doing the Phyllis Tickle 500-year translation, which at this point is a bit optimistic. I can see that this is what you're about also. I support the conversation, new themes in worship, spiritual paradigms within the Christian tradition. I think we, the faithful, are looking for a newly restated gospel. I hear you say it. I read your books. Please say it as clearly and loudly as you can so we can all overhear.
Well, awful lot going on there. My goodness. So I want to first, thanks for that question. And I want to try to give it some small fraction of the respect that it deserves. But let me start by saying, when you and Diane and I are engaging in this big, overarching multidisciplinary thing, we're going to inevitably use generalizations. And one of the things I think we have to do we have to give ourselves permission to do that and be think critically about it. And so I'd like to take a word like the church and just say, it would be an interesting discipline for people. If people read my last few books, I think they'll notice that I don't use that term, the church. I even use the term Christianity with care, because if we didn't use the term the church, we'd have to say that there isn't one thing called the church. There are churches that stand for diametrically opposed realities. And so this sort of generalization can make us think we're only talking about one thing, because the church is not in decline. You could say one of our biggest problems is that there are forms of the church, forms that enfranchise white supremacy, forms that support exploitation of the environment, forms that favor the rich and disfavor the poor, forms that are all for weapons and war, those forms are going strong and have had a bit of a resurgence since 2001. They have more power than, at least for the last 4 years in the United States, they have more power than they've had. And these forms of the church in Brazil and in Philippines and in a number of other places, they have more access to power than they've ever had. They were on a sugar high for a period of time, if not a full-blown hit of crack. But so the first thing is the generalization about the church. It challenges us, I think, to say there are opposite things going on under that rubric. And as to the question about the gospel, I think if we were to, this is a huge subject trip we could, spend hours on, but if we were to say in Jesus' moment, the gospel was defined by those particular realities that he was born into, just as we're talking about September 11th as this big deal. The massacre of the Jewish resistance in Nazareth, in what was the town where about 500 Jewish men were crucified when Jesus was a boy? Anyway, not far from where he grew up. I'm sure that was a big thing on their mind. This massacre was a big thing. The fact that the Romans had successfully won over the Jewish elite by building them a temple. And this feeling that our religious leaders have sold out to the Romans to get money and power and status. And we don't really trust them anymore because their alliances are not just with us, they're with the Romans, right? I mean, does all this start to sound familiar? Mm-hmm. So if we were to say Jesus effectively articulates the gospel for his moment, and our job then is to not assume that we're always in exactly the same moment, but to follow his example by articulating gospel for our moment too, as his followers. And that's why if you were to ask me, I don't think there's one way to boil down the gospel. But what I would say today is that there is a way to save ourselves from the suicidal path that we're on. There's a way to be saved from the suicidal path that we're on. And it involves loving the earth, loving our neighbor, including the outsider and the outcast and the enemy, properly loving ourselves, and then loving the God who loves, and loving the power of love and the loving presence of God that infuses all those other loves. That there really is a way, and it is as easy as repenting, in the sense, as easy as flipping in our minds from loving money most, or loving power most, or loving domination most, to actually believing that love is the power.
Well, one thing that strikes me when you say that, and really the first half of his question, is that in many ways the 9/11 attack was an attack on our truest religion.
Yes.
Right. Like if you think of economism as a world religion, it's the most effective one. It's spread, and we're now seeing at 9/11, the violence it has exported on the world came home. And after 9/11, in the last 20 years, that violence that we've poured out on nature, on native peoples, the whole history of slavery into Jim Crow has now started to show up. In one sense, 9/11 begins a story where you realize that our deepest allegiance was to a kind of power that is expressed in the military, but it's primarily expressed in kind of a multinational type of consumer capitalism. And that was the primary target that was there. And I wonder if one of the contrasts for thinking about the gospel, if we take that history seriously, thinking about the context that you said, Brian, is that certain forms of religion, and for us as Christians, certain forms of Christianity, can function therapeutically. They fit you to the system and regime of the day. And so you become a great worker, a great citizen. You are committed to the entrepreneurial pursuits or that kind of thing. Or they take a prophetic form where your identity in the life-giving way of Jesus, or this, obviously expressed in Islam and Judaism. And anyway, it is one that challenges the dominant system and its violence that is being expressed, from 9/11, the war on terror, torture, to the way you see capitalism affecting Black bodies and the planet and all those type of things.
I'm so glad you say that, because in that question, the word religion is another one of those generalizations. The idea that, and you might have this information right at your fingertips or the tip of your tongue, Trip, but the word religion as we use it now is a relatively recent invention. And I think for most people through the world, religion and culture they weren't easily separable things the way they are for a lot of people today. So that assumption is behind that question too, that you can attack, that to attack the World Trade Center is not to attack the religion that writes "In God we trust" upon the God in which we really trust, and the religion that has equated the invisible hand of the market with something divine, so that to attack capitalism is to be a heretic. So all of that, I think the question helps surface all of that that's there too.
Yeah. And I think you can see it just in the way any threat to American superiority, either economically or militarily, you start getting labels get attached to it. Yes. And socialism's another boogeyman again, right? Yes. Like the post 9/11, those who came of age after 9/11 have just as positive a response, if not more, to critiques of capitalism than the deep affirmations of it the previous generations had, because they were coming out of those glory days you talked about. And then so now what happens? You have a presidential candidate that sounds like the most conservative prime minister in the UK in years, and he's labeled a socialist. And but that socialist is a boogie word for that whole network of ideologies that function kind of like master signifiers, where the labels, we don't know what they mean. We just know that they're ours and we'll defend them violently. It's like a Christian when they say, "I'm a biblical Christian." You're like, really? You're a biblical Christian? Like the Family Research Council, you saw their like tweets how the Bible is universally pro-life. And you're like, God like puts one family on a boat and murders everyone. Because God upset, but the phrase biblical or the Bible is it's a statement claiming authority, but it doesn't mean anything. And then the label you put on your enemy does the same type of maneuver.
Yeah. This is where I'm always glad that the way my life turned out, I was an English major in college, because you develop some amount of sensitivity to language, and it helps you in a lot of dimensions of life.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So I'm going to flip my earpiece sideways because once a third person joined the stream, I couldn't share the audio. But here's a question from Lynn. About how evil Trump and I need to put it at the beginning. Lynn, go back to the beginning, please. There we go.
Hi, guys. It was very cathartic to hear once again about how evil Trump is. But I need to find people in our faith community who are doing the constructive work of trying to figure out how our little local ridiculous battles in our little churches make any difference in the world right now. I am certain it has to do with love, but can this group start to look for concrete connections between the daily work of church life and the larger questions of what is happening globally? Thank you so much.
All right.
I sure love that question. So, Chip, I'd love to hear what you'd have to say about that too. Do you want to go first, or?
Okay. I guess two things. One, the opening line it's cathartic to hear Trump is evil. Like, I don't want to say a person's evil, but I also know, like, our inability to be clear about things that are wrong is how we end up with congregations and disciples that don't know what their deepest convictions are, because we're always sidestepping clarity, right? And so when you think about the way when you were sharing about the way authoritarian mindsets work, but also what happens out of that kind of power, it is a perverse form of power. But I don't want to give ontological reality to evil, but it is what we is identified as evil is the absence of God's desire for those relations, for that energy, for those actions, and such. But I do know, like, at the heart of what I heard in the energy of Lynn's question is like, yes, I'm glad someone's clear about how ugly this is. And then I show up at my church, and what in the world is what we're doing there, contributing to something beautiful? And it's in that place, I think, we need to recognize that our anxieties and fears we have are connected to a moment where we know more than we could have ever known before as a species. And so we have real legitimate fears, climate change, threats to democracy, all these type of stuff. Like they're all there. And then our own agency feels smaller and smaller. And in that space, then you get to a community of faith and you have a fight about the budget or what curriculum you're going to use, or just that you have to sit in the choir with that person, or right now masks, or do we need all of our children volunteers to be vaccinated? And there are all these ways that you get, and you have those fights and you go, this is what we're dealing with here. And we know these big things are going on. And it's at that moment, I think we always need to remind ourselves and be in a community that says that the body of Christ is always present and at work. And the call of Christ always comes in each moment, that God desires us to participate more deeply moment to moment. And that only happens when we say yes with what we can do and what we can say and how we can show up to other people. When our fears and anxieties are like a blanket that covers over the possibility of our own agency, what we can say and do and how we respond to what's there, then we actually aren't able to contribute in that moment and hopefully create habits and communities of grace-filled, loving, justice-seeking responses. And so one of the things I try to repeat when in those type of teaching situations is there's a difference between being responsible to someone, your kids, all the way up to your country and your neighbors, and responsible for. And a lot of time our anxiety about what we're responsible to, because we aren't the only agents, means we fail to be responsible for what we can, our own actions, our own words, and our own contributions to each moment of becoming. Yes. And if we're faithful in those little things and have more communities of faithfulness, then I think we open up more possibilities than we can see. Because when we say yes, we're joining the God who loves us and has refused to be God without us and is present at every moment, be it in complete faithfulness the moment before, or you ended up in Sheol. There is no, place that escapes the love of God in Christ Jesus. And so I think it's, what does it mean to be faithful in the present? And that's where I'm reminded of like that scene where Frodo is complaining to Gandalf right before Gandalf's taken out by the Balrog in the mines of Moria. And he's like, why did this get thrown upon me? Like, what am I doing here carrying this ring through this thing? Like, what, blah, blah, he's complaining. And Gandalf says, you don't get to pick where you were born and your history and things and the task that's given to you. And you don't know if it turns out great, but we'll be faithful to it nonetheless.
Yeah.
And I think it's that faithful nonetheless that as Christians, we say, like, that is what faith in the resurrection looks like. That we're faithful for what we're responsible for, and we'll work to be faithful where we're responsible to, and not let the anxiety and fear keep us from, rejecting, dismissing possible faithfulness in the moment.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's always nice to see Frodo used as an example of our Hobbit Humanity. So well said. Maybe I could offer two things, one sort of theoretical and one very practical. On a theoretical level, it might help us to be more gracious and understanding of where our churches are if we have a longer view. And I think I can illustrate this. I had two experiences in the last couple of years. One of a neighbor who became increasingly vicious, to the point that the last time I saw him and I said hello on the sidewalk, he grunted at me. And I thought, what? He didn't even say a word. He just grunted. And then I found out a few weeks later that he was rapidly descending into Parkinson's disease. So I interpreted his grunt in one way when I didn't know about this longer disease that he's dealing with. And then as soon as I heard that, I was able to have a more charitable interpretation. And then a mentor of mine, the last time I saw him, he's just said some things that seemed incredibly just out of character for him. And then I heard from his spouse a couple of months ago that he's descending into dementia. And suddenly it made those statements make sense. And I think if what we could say is, look, what we know as the church and all of our denominations, Catholic or Protestant, we happen to be born into them when they were deep in the throes of a disease, a multifaceted disease. It's not like they were well in the 1950s or the 1830s or something. They've been unwell for a very, very long time. That service to an economic system that you mentioned earlier and that we were talking about, that's got a long-standing history. So if we could start by saying, it's not like our churches had it right and then they've sort of lost the plot. They've been struggling for centuries with a complex disease. And so one of the things you do with someone who's not well is you lower your expectations. It's the gracious thing to do. You lower your expectations short term, and then you do everything you can to help them be healthy again. So that's my general comment. The specific thing I'd say is a way to help them be healthy again. If you criticize them, if you attack them, if you walk away from them and throw a few insults on your way out, you don't necessarily help them be healthy again. And what I have found, I call it the power of a non-directive statement. Instead of telling them what to do, you insert something into the system that they have to cope with that will have a redemptive impact. And one of the ways of doing that is to make a non-directive statement about yourself that invites their concern and empathy. Because any voluntary association of people, they care about the well-being of their peers. So if you were to say, someone says, how are you doing? And you say, I'm okay in many ways, but I'm just sort of brokenhearted. It feels like there's such big problems in the world, and our congregation is tied up arguing about these other things. Now, if you stop there and just let that non-directive statement sit in the system, what it does, if you tell people what they need to do, or if you make a threat, I'm going to leave unless you get over this, and it sets another set of reactions going. But if you bring some pain, heartbreak, concern, anxiety, it allows others to have empathy. And I think you have an effect on them that you'd have in almost no other way. Now, that doesn't bring necessarily fast results, but one of the things we've seen after many decades of religious struggle and decline in many quarters, there are no quick results. And this is a deep process of going from a kind of ill health to good health. And that, you can take a pill to reduce your symptoms, but it takes time to overcome an infection or a pandemic, as we're finding out.
Yeah. No, I think that's really smart. I mean, I love Bowen family systems theory and that type of the non-directive statement is really addressing the fact that a lot of times anxious systems need a problem. And the problem is actually the network of relations, right? Like it's the way we relate, the energy that's there, perverse type of energy. But what happens in a system that's anxious and toxic is it needs to find a problem, right? So it could be immigrants. It could be a music choice. It could be parents that are fighting, the kids' health or grades, right? Like, so you need somewhere for all the energy to go. And then if you take that issue seriously as a leader or in a community, you think you could remedy everyone's solutions and it doesn't fix the toxicity. But the non-direct statement there is really an invitation for them to acknowledge, to give you empathy and space to be yourself. And it short circuits that desire to find a place we can pour out our anxiousness on. Because underneath most of those systems, it's not like if you just ask even your polar opposite person from another political party, like, what kind of life do you want for your grandkids? The answers are going to be really similar.
Yes.
And yet there's fear and ugliness and different deep commitments. But the democracy is supposed to be creating a space, when done well, that you can have a multiplicity of deep reservoirs of values that decide being citizens with us, with different neighbors, is better world than eliminating them. And so often the anxiousness has to find a problem, an identified patient, and it breaks it off. Anyway, at some point,
well said.
At some point, I want to do a whole class on family systems theory because I enjoy it. And most people are not surprised when a process person thinks family systems theory makes sense.
Hey, Chip, when you do that, this is a tangent, but do that definitely, because I think that would be so useful. Then do something on René Girard and mimetic theory, and then do them together, then mash them together. Because I think one of the things that mimetic theory does is it shows why systems generate their own anxiety. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's recently won the kind of the Bowen, the School of Bowen Studies, or Research Center for Bowen Studies, did one of their keynotes was on systems theory and mimetic theory and how they're related. Anyway, that's not a question anyone sent, though. If anyone wants to send it for next time, they can watch Brian and Tripp talk about it. Here is I'm going to play an audio question, and then I'll read another question, but they're both around similar themes. So this is Ted.
Well, thanks for this program, Tripp. And this is Ted. My question is, how much has culture affected the religious right versus how much has religious right affected culture? The little bit that I've read say that in regards to authority and authoritarianism, psychologists kind of go one direction, say that people follow a personality-driven cult, whereas sociologists would say that it's more of a cultural stance.
So you get there about that, the relationship of culture, which way it's going, and then Cliff sent the text, and he said, "I've been thinking about the tendency of the church to get behind authoritarian leaders since reading Stanley's How Fascism Works last year. He speaks of creating a mythical past, preaching the people's victimhood, supporting hierarchy, specifically patriarchy, as well as undermining external sources of truth like the press or science. I'm wondering whether you see a particular vulnerability to this sort of political movement within the evangelical church, and if you see theological roots for it. If so, the question then is, what do we do about it in our churches now?" Mm-hmm. So I know you have a recent ebook about authoritarianism. Everyone should go check out. You've talked a little bit about it in the class. The podcast you're doing with the Center for Action and Contemplation also includes things on this. So I think both of those questions are really important. So how would you kind of frame a response?
Yeah. Well, first, to take culture, psychology, sociology it's a very intelligent question, because he's realizing that depending on which community you stand with and which vantage point you stand with, you see different things. So when you are thinking in terms of culture as a historically evolving phenomenon with certain, just like a person with certain consistent traits that then goes through different, times of change, or you're thinking of psychology starting with the individual, or you're thinking about sociology starting with groups, you notice different things. And I think this is one of our challenges because of the way our modern academy is set up. We join different communities and we see different things. And it's one of the reasons why we need to listen to each other, because one of my mentors used to say, what you focus on determines what you miss. In other words, the community you're with will see certain things, but you'll also miss certain things. But what I'm starting with lately, and Tripp, this is relevant because one of the recent Homebrew Christianity podcasts was about evolutionary psychology, and another great podcast. I'm looking at this as a biological and evolutionary issue to start with. In other words, I'm taking seriously that we humans are evolved in an evolutionary process, and where we come from is hunter-gatherer bands who formed temporary associations in feudalism, for example, or in kingdom and empire, for example. But our brains have evolved. And our culture has evolved, and it's a little hard for us to tell what is inherent in our brain and what is a cultural expression of things that are inherent in our brain. But here we are after a couple 100,000 years of evolution, and we have certain habits, and we describe them in psychology, and we describe how it works out in groups in sociology. And it's inevitable, because religion involves individuals and groups, that psychology and sociology will be expressed in religion. So I'd like to try to have as integrative an approach as we can, where we take all of the set of these different perspectives, and maybe when we use a word like wisdom, we're trying to integrate these things in a wise way. But you put all of them together. And gosh, when you really study the Bible, you see this is just seething in the biblical text. We human beings need leaders, and leaders can oppress us. And we live with that tension. I remember years ago, Walter Brueggemann pointed out, if you ask what is the biblical, to go back to that word, what is the biblical attitude toward monarchy in Scripture? Well, you find some people who say, we used to be really a mess because back then we didn't have a king and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So the monarchy's great. Or you have the story of Samuel where, when you accept the monarchy, you're rejecting God. And so you have this deep ambivalence built into the biblical text about monarchy. I think we need to see that as just a fact of life. Mm-hmm. Any form of leadership that's strong enough to solve your problems can also do you great damage. And so we live with that. And it creates, to go back to your word before, Tripp, a sense of responsibility, especially in a democracy. Now, look, we may lose our democracy. There are days I think it's incredibly fragile project. And in some ways, both January 6th and then the fall of Afghanistan remind us what a fragile and difficult project democracy is. And that there's this sort of default mechanism of feudalism where rich and powerful people with a lot of weapons end up having the power, and we all decide which feudal lord or feudal cartel or feudal mafia or feudal party, fascist party we want to align with. And but in democracy, while we have that, it reminds us of this big responsibility that it gives us to try to behave with wisdom. And that involves, and we're going against the grain in this because so much of our democratic system is about short-term wins, short-term polling. But many of the problems we face now are very, very long-term. And so they have to be embedded in us by other communities. And this returns me back to the question that was asked earlier. One of the things that our faith communities need to do moving forward is get clear in their mind what are the virtues and the values, the character qualities that we think long-term need to be embedded, and how can we really do a better job at embedding them.
Mm-hmm. Something that it came to mind, like in those questions and in session 2, one of the questions was about the link between in the evangelical culture and the religious right kind of stuff, and kind of the right-wing extremist authoritarian movement in the States. And I think one element of it is evangelicals. They're the kind of individualism that's at the heart of evangelical Christianity is similar to the kind of individualism in traditional, more conservative politics. Like, yeah. I'm from the government and I'm from the ecclesiastical authority, and I'm here to help. Right? Yes. Like it is like a triggering statement. And I think it's important to recognize like that how one relates to authority that's not part of one's kind of primary network of relations. Yeah. That is connected to a cognitive mechanism in the same way the authoritarian is. Like, what kind of relationships make you feel safe are different. There are certain people who are predisposed to trust things that have been around a long time, and there are others that don't. And so it's not like, if we take evolutionary psych seriously, there are some things that are currently memes we use to shame the people that don't agree with us that are just their cognitive mechanisms. And if that group didn't exist, humans would not be here right now. Right. And so once you get that inheritance, I think we need to take seriously as more progressive Christians and just the educated culture making elites that there's genuine resentment. There's just genuine resentment that the educated kind of culture making elite create a culture where their own lives are no longer on TV shows. The thing that doesn't get canceled is making fun of them. And almost every other group, it gets more protection, which they should. It's just imagine being someone who is trying to be a healthy expression of themselves, of where they are. And then those who control culture, those who represent the wise aristocracy the government's listening to, are the ones who culturally demonstrate resentment for their well-being and what matters to them. When you do that, it's connected to what you said earlier, like criticizing people, shaming them, leaving with a curse on the way out is not a way to invite anyone to relate better. Right. And so, yes, there are deep connections, and they're connected to psychological mechanisms, and maybe that helps us take it less personal. But also, we need to recognize how we're seen when we function as progressives through culture in similar ways as they function through government, where a minority seizes all the power they can get and shames the other ones into compliance.
Yes. Boy. And, for me as a straight white male, I feel that because I've had to come to terms with the way that I inherited power and privilege that I never asked for. I didn't ask to be, to get that privilege. And the fact that I didn't ask for it, a little bit like Frodo's word from Gandalf, it doesn't change the fact that now I have to deal with it. And I think part of what we're realizing is that those of us who are economically advantaged, I think globally, if you make more than about $35,000 a year, you're in the global 1%. And if you in the United States, if you make over something like $300,000 a year, you're in the national 1%. But those of us who are in the 1%, we work hard and we don't, kill anybody, and we don't necessarily have any conscious hatred toward anybody. But we don't realize that we got in the part of the system where the rich are getting richer. And there's a whole lot of people they've just been left behind, and their physical labor gets exploited and their location gets exploited because they live in a part of the country where all the businesses are moving away and not moving toward them, and the hospitals are moving away and the schools are moving away. And so you when you have empathy for them, you realize, oh, if the privileged don't use their power on behalf of the people who lack it, then they're going to be resented. And that's as sure a cycle as you could ever ask for. And suddenly now, instead of having to point fingers at other people, a whole bunch of us have to look at our own responsibility and then ask the question, what will actually make a difference for those people? Ironically, how can I serve the people who resent me? Because I realize that their resentment of me, it's not personal necessarily. It might be, I might just be a jerk and they're resenting me. But very often, it's just a default mechanism because they know this thing is working for me and it's not working for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to ask the next two questions. Otherwise, I think we will derail for extended period of time. Each of these is like a whole podcast worth of topic. So Keith and Connie both have questions around fear-based religion and the gospel. So I'll read them both, and then you can. And these are short ones. Let's see. Keith said, "Isn't all religion fear-based? It seems like it. Either fear of death, fear of the afterlife, fear of triumph of evil, etc. What do we do for religion without or beyond fear?" And then Connie asked, "How do you tell the gospel without first establishing a context of fear? I don't want to tell anyone anymore that they're a sinner, and here's the consequences for it. I got to convince you of this. Now you can believe in hell, so I can eventually tell them the gospel. I think the good news should be good without persuading them of something I'm not too sure of anyway."
Okay. Well, there's a couple of really, really great questions. So, hey, I right now want to sort of testify that I am a avid listener to Homebrewed Christianity. And a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a month or two ago, you interviewed someone to talk about evolutionary biology and to talk about the necessity of pain in evolution. Could you just do a quick summary of that?
Oh, yeah. It's Bethany Soloretter. She's at Oxford, working in religion and science, Baptist, grew up Canadian Baptist and has moved around ecumenically. And so she's been in charismatic mainline Protestant types in the UK and evangelical ones. And she does a really good job, I think, articulating the role of pain and suffering as a positive part of evolution in ways that help all those groups think about what it would mean to take evolution seriously. And she says, a lot of times we don't recognize that if we didn't experience pain, genuine complex life couldn't have evolved. That pain is actually a gift because it enables you to cultivate a relationship with something other than yourself in ways that can lead to flourishing, greater relationality, depth of experience, right? So all the way from a single-celled organism moving away from toxins towards something that's positive to, right, dogs and or plants to humans doing it. Like the need for pain creates a context where you can have relationships that lead to flourishing. And without that mechanism, you don't know how you could evolve the space for free, genuinely loving relations. But that also means, and the same gift for the freedom that creates genuine loving relations is a corresponding negative side of that power, which is the experience of pain and suffering. And that's intensified for us when we recognize that the gift of relationality, the gift of that when we experience the pain, it's less than what could have been. And so we don't just experience the pain as human beings, we experience the loss of the potential. So when you're betrayed by a friend, or anyway, but that goes back to God's, if you're a theist and looking at evolution, how the response to pain actually creates the context for genuine, loving, free relationships and freedom.
So, and I just thought that was so brilliant, and that was a great summary. So if you start by, as she was talking, I kept thinking about what's happening in our oceans, and As I understand it, about half of the air, the oxygen that we breathe. So like I always think of it as one of my lungs depends on plankton out in the ocean. And those plankton, as the ocean acidifies, carbonic acid and other things acidify the ocean. You have to imagine little plankton floating around in the surface of the ocean, and it encounters acidified water, and it needs a receptor to tell it, this will destroy you. And so now, you develop movement because little flagellates can, wave a little tail to get away from the acidified water that will destroy them. And the reason I bring this up is because when you ask a question about fear, you realize that fear is inseparable from pain. And what you could say is fear is the anticipation of pain. Fear is the realization, if I move toward that, it's going to harm me. So if pain is inevitable, fear is inevitable. If pain is baked in, fear is baked in. But here's the issue. We get in trouble when powerful people prosper by making us afraid of the wrong things and distracting us from being afraid of the right things, because this is a world where real dangers exist. So, and this, I think these two questions in many ways surface this deep issue in the Christian faith, which is this, as you and I both know, but a whole lot of Christians don't know, Catholic, Protestant, whatever. In the Hebrew scriptures, there is no hell. The idea of being sent to hell when you die or sent to heaven when you die, in the Hebrew scriptures, there's just not that much of a conception of afterlife at all. And certainly not do these 10 commandments and you go to heaven, and don't do them, you go to hell. That's just nowhere there, even though Christians have been taught to read it into that. And I think we have this sense that what was going on in the Jewish world is this sense, if we don't live wisely, our crops will fail. Well, that was some ecological insight. Mm-hmm. If we don't live wisely, the poor will, be hurt, and there will be social instability. We better take care of the poor. That would cause damage and pain that we should be afraid of. We better take care of the poor. So there was this sense of there are real dangers in life, and a wise community knows what those dangers are and knows how to be afraid of them in a way that leads them to the right action to live wisely. But what happens in the Christian religion is a group of people prosper by making you afraid of hell. And they don't necessarily make you afraid of misogyny, or make you afraid of racism, or make you afraid of carelessness toward the poor, or make you afraid of ecological destruction. They just make you afraid of not being the right kind of pious and religious person. So, because then God will send you to hell. And hell is such a totalizing, absolute evil and pain. It's infinite pain, that it just reduces everything else to insignificance. And you can get away with murder when you have a fear like that you're controlled by, and you're controlling other people by. And so what I suppose what I want to say is, don't get rid of fear, because if you get rid of fear, you get rid of pain. And if you get rid of pain, you don't survive. What I would say is, we've got to discover the right things to be afraid of, and the wisdom to learn how to respond to those fears, not by being in panic or controlled, but by being wise in our response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the kind of fears that are appropriate are ones that are threats to the whole web of life.
Yes, and
it's flourishing, not a threat to your eternal conscious destination. Yeah. And because if you feel like the gospel to be preached requires convincing someone that of all the problems God's good creation faces, there's another one, and it's even worse. Yes. And God has it out for you, and you're God's enemy, unless you get the remedy that only I possess. That type of fear has already perverted the picture of creation that you see in Genesis, where human beings are embedded in God's good creation and are deeply responsible for the flourishing of life. And then you see human beings' responsibility as we have bigger communities. all the way from tribes to kingdoms and throughout. What do you constantly see is that the people of God are precisely the ones who recognize life and community as gift and blessing and spread it and share it with others, even the immigrants in your midst, even the outcast and the orphans, right? So like when the problem that the gospel of the one that practices solidarity to the cross is if that's the story you're in, it should not be one that turns us away from those that bear crosses in this world, yes. Human and non-human. And I think that like that's why the gospel can get an eye roll. It's and I remember you it's your story. I just remember you telling it multiple times when we were both speaking at events where it was everything must change time, where you did the problems facing the world.
Yes.
Tell that. Like, I think that's so good. And I've used it when I'm dealing with liberal Protestants that don't think know you.
So I was a youth worker and I was asked to speak one day at a youth camp, and we were meeting in a barn, and I was unprepared, not because I was lazy. I just had so many other things going on. I had a lot of responsibilities at this youth camp. So I had the beginning of my talk planned. I just didn't know where it was going to go. And so I asked people, what are the issues that people are arguing about in your churches? Because these are teenagers and some college students who attend church. What are the issues? And everybody started bringing up things. And this is a couple decades ago, but some of them haven't changed, but creation versus evolution, women in leadership. Do we accept gay people? Guitars versus organs, traditional versus contemporary. All those issues were coming up. And then I said, okay, tell me when you and your friends at school are having a serious conversation, what are the issues that you guys talk about? And I remember the first one was overpopulation, and the next one, and then was, nuclear war and ecological destruction, and the lack of the complete the lack of sync between the two. I remember shocked me, and I had this sort of feeling rush up my spine, which was, oh crap, the better job I do at keeping kids involved in church, which is in some ways what youth ministry is. It's unwritten contract. The better job I do keeping kids involved in church, the more I keep them focused on the list of relatively trivial matters, and I keep them distracted from the list of existential matters.
Well, one of the things I like about that story then, and then thinking about it now, is at this point, there are fewer and fewer churches that can keep a straight face. Right. Because yes. All those nitpicky concerns yes. were the kind of concerns where you inherit Christendom, you assume cultural privilege and the continued prevalence of your space yes. in the world. Right. And so success, if you're a youth minister, is keeping them in the church and then keeping them distracted with these things while the church yes. fails being an agent of change on these much bigger ones. I think that is one of the easiest ways to find out the health of a church. Ask the teenagers what the people in the church deeply like to argue about. Yes. Have you thought about the second question about how you tell a gospel without fear? One of the things that strikes me, even about how Paul talks in Romans and in Galatians, when you get the contrast of new and old shows up throughout Paul. Yes. And I never noticed until, I don't know, sometime in my 20s, when I was in a seminar on politics in Paul with a bunch of philosophers. And one of the people that's not even Christian was like, why do Christians, this was his question, why do Christians get obsessed with telling me how I'm a sinner and things? And Paul thinks that sin is something you see after you've encountered the gospel. And then I was like, that's not right. I'm like, I don't like doing the gospel that way, but come on. And I go look through and I realize for Paul, like the old man, the old self, the sinner, these type of things are how you see your life after you've encountered the gospel. And, yes. and I realized it was like, my family were rural Baptist preachers for my first half growing up. So we got like used 3rd generation used cars from congregants that felt bad,
Yes.
And I remember the first time we got like a car that was only 3 or 4 years old. And
Yes.
then all of a sudden the one car we had became the old car.
Yes.
But it wasn't before that. And
Yes.
it wasn't even a judgment of what was there. It was
Yes.
just in light of this
Yes.
gift
Yes.
that is old. And I
Yes.
think that's a beautiful way of talking about the invitation that Christ gives, because he encounters, be it Nicodemus or a woman caught in adultery. You could go through all the narratives, but I think Paul's onto it, that what Jesus said is like, you have this giant religious thing going on. And then Jesus shows up and goes, the kingdom of God is here.
Yes.
Right? You didn't have to do anything to get prepared or whatever, but it's happening and you are invited. Or
Yes.
the most true thing about you right now is you're God's beloved. How does
Yes.
that? And if we did a better job
Yes.
of
Yes.
stating with confidence that the very source of all existence knows our neighbors, our family, our friends, and our enemies' names and deeply cares,
Yes.
and that our community is committed to treating them how God sees them, then the gospel is a beautiful thing. And they could
Yes.
roll their eyes and go, I love that trip. You might think the homeless first century Jew is the key to all existence. Is kind of weird and nonsensical, but it's still pretty,
Yes.
I think that I'd never noticed the gospel and it begins with the new and then reveals the old. Not
Yes.
anyway.
Oh my gosh, that's beautifully put. It actually, we were just talking about youth ministry, and you just brought back a memory I haven't thought of in many, many years. But I grew up in church. I was on my way out. I went on this youth retreat, had this very powerful spiritual experience. And I came back to my school and I sat with a bunch of guys at lunch in the cafeteria. And, I hadn't really realized that we were pretty crude and pretty cruel. But the guys would make comments about people walking in. And I remember this this girl walked in the cafeteria, and the guy next to me makes some really crude comment about her. And I just remember I said to him, dude, that's not cool. You don't need to say stuff like that. It was the first time I'd ever stood up to my peer group. And it was because I saw her with different eyes. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. So there's 2 people. Well, there are 4 people that brought up different elements of racism, systemic structural realities, how you'd frame the challenge, how do you deal with people in different generations that have experienced it differently. And there's a number of questions. Dan, Keith both mentioned that. Will mentioned it. Catherine did. I got a rather lengthy email from Steve, who I messaged back and was like, are you okay if I share the edited version of this? And he said, yes. And his honesty, I think, makes it a way to talk about how a number of those issues, and others said, how do I handle this pastorally? So I thought to myself, I'm going to read this and let Brian handle it pastorally on the internet. And then it's a way of thinking about it. So Steve's in the class. He said, the thought occurred to me as I was listening through the first session. Towards the end, the discussion, there were some comments about recognizing the harm done to indigenous people and, of course, slavery and Jim Crow. Reparations in the form of monetary awards or the return of lands is a big stumbling block for a lot of white people who I think otherwise are very open to trying to change laws and policies in ways that don't create racist circumstances across many areas such as education, housing, employment, policing, etc. I think Kendi's book on how to be an anti-racist had me thinking about not only what has been done in the past and continues to be done, but what's possible and what would move the ball forward. I'm a 72-year-old white guy who grew up poor and lived close to the poor African-American community because that's where poor white people live. Not near the but not in the black neighborhoods. I had friends who were black, and I interacted with the black community a fair amount when I worked in a local corner deli at a time before 7-Elevens existed. When I was about 10 to 11 in Reading, Pennsylvania, I played with one of my black friends who lived a block behind my mom's apartment. I learned that the black friend's mother had asked my mother to stop me from playing with her son because she was afraid if the white people saw us together, they'd attack her family. That stayed with me all these years. With that in the background, what would be helpful in making real progress, it seems, is removing some of the systemic and institutional racism is to get out of the way and dismantle the barriers. Less focus on reparations per se, and more focus on making sure the obstacles to success and growth are removed. More remedy than reparation. Focus on things like education, medical care, housing, equality, equal job opportunities, etc. Many African American and other people of color I know are less concerned about reparations for past transgressions and more on clearing a path for a decent future. Maybe less backward looking, except to acknowledge a terrible past. More focus on, okay, so what now? What can be done to be more anti-racist and stop repeating the cycle? And of course, how can a progressive Christianity help make that happen?
Well, there's a question for a 3-minute answer, right? What a great question. And what a great way he tells his story. And what a great way he just brings us into his lived experience. So I'll just tell you a couple of things I like about the question, Trip. One is the sense that we've got to make reparations for the past, but I think all of us know the debt is incalculable. And there's a certain kind of mechanism that I think a lot of white people are both afraid of, but it's their assumption. And that is, we could fix this and put it behind us forever and get on with life, never having to talk about race again, I just think that kind of calculus doesn't work. And it brings me back to an experience I had, and I want to protect confidentialities here, but I was invited once. As far as I know, I was the only white person in a room of several hundred indigenous people. And it was, it's a great honor when you're in those settings. And I don't want to in any way, use that in a way that dishonors the gift I was given. But I remember someone was up at the mic and he said something about reparations. And he made this offhand comment. It went something like this: if white people only knew the only reason we talk so much about reparations is because we know we'll never have a good relationship. And in other words, he was basically saying white people have shown us that they don't want a relationship with us as equals, a respectful human relationship. And since we've given up on, and since they've given up on that, or since they've proven themselves unwilling to engage in that, then the best we can do is a financial payoff. Now, look, I'm not saying that all Native Americans or anybody would feel that way, but I remember in that moment feeling this grief in my heart that what people want the most is not money. They want relationship. They want dignity. They want equality. They want the things that the gospel is about, loving one another as ourselves, and recognizing all of us as part of the beloved web of creation and the beloved human species, as part of that larger web. So all that's to say, something I love about this question is it challenges us to say, what is it we're looking for ultimately? And we need a vision of that. And sometimes I think it's one of the reasons we have literature, and we have art. And, for all of its faults, that on the bridge of Star Trek, we still have a powerful white guy in charge in most of the different iterations of Star Trek. But even the beginnings of saying on the bridge are people of many different races and cultures, and they still have their accents and they still have their, it's the first step in the 1960s and 70s of imagining a different way of running the world. And so we have so many different ways of capturing this in literature. And that's what we have in the Bible. It's, when lions lie down with lambs, I don't think that's saying that in the eschaton, all of the evolution of of predator incisors will be gone because they're going to chew on grass. It's predatory people will stop destroying their fellow vulnerable humans. It's a vision for humanity to live together with our differences. And so all that's to say that I felt all of that in that question. And maybe the only other thing I can say pastorally is to say, this could be a great thing for white people to do, or the people in the dominant or hegemonic position to do. So for example, in many African countries, there's a dominant tribe or a hegemonic tribe that got there because the colonizers lifted them up to a position of superiority. Whoever is in the position of power, one of the smartest things we can do is listen to the people who are not in the position of power and ask them, help me envision a world that you feel would be better. Mm-hmm. And the thing you can't do is you can't take the first thing they say and say that's their final answer, but it's just to get that conversation going, because a whole lot of people, both the dominators and the dominated, they have never asked that question before. They're just trying to survive another day. To create a little space, a little clearing, to even imagine that question is so new. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the things that I think we have to do. And what that will do is eventually qualify us to move beyond resistance and even the idea of reparations as fixing a past, to say what we really are in the process is creating a new possibility, a new covenant, a new agreement, a new arrangement, a new way of living.
Yeah, I think that's important. When I responded to Steve to make sure he was cool if I read it, because I've worked at churches where Steve would be the most conservative person at the church.
Yes.
And he would have been like, you're not exactly sure about demanding reparations right now, blah, 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 blah. And yes. Where he would be the edgiest. Yes. And we probably have people that go and serve churches that are in all of those. Yes. And the fact that he said yes as a 72-year-old white man to share his own story, right? Like an experiences that shaped it. He shared a number of things. He admits he cares deeply. He said that he's listening both to his friends. He's reading yes. and wrestling with it in the moment. He acknowledges it's messy and then insists he and the church still have a part to play. Yeah. And I think that fear of, like, even me wanting to make sure you're cool if you say this, like if I read this, yes. shows us that we're doing something wrong when this is a dominant conversation taking place in our nation. And then even among more religious progressives that care, we hesitate often and then try to decide, depending on who's listening, how do I want to pitch this? Yeah. And one of the things Steve's sharing models is that if you're saying, I care, I'm listening, it's messy, and I know I have a part to play, that actually opens up the space for people that got there by different means that would speak their commitments differently, either out of their own commitment or that's just the dominant opinions they're around. But until we're even allowed to get clumsy on issues, yeah. it's real hard to rally and act. And I think that is I think that is another place fear shows up, is where you're scared, especially for people of privilege, that you don't know how am I going to be a good ally in this, or am I doing this right? Yeah. And so people dodge things. And I just love the fact that Steve, 72, said yes to raising this. And I'm sure plenty of people would put him in a different place in their congregation and friend group. But a lot of us are always hesitant to be that vulnerable about the experiences around issues that shape us and what kind of solutions are more attractive or less attractive. And then to go, this is where I am, but I don't know the right answer. We got to do something.
Yeah, gosh, and the irony that hits me at this moment is that what we need in this situation is a lot more grace. I'm not saying grace about the racists or, obviously they need their own kind of grace. But I'm saying we need grace among the people who care and want to make things better. Because what tends to happen is when you're new to a conversation, you seize on a solution. You think, oh, simple problem, easy solution, and you become a fundamentalist about that solution. And then very often you live with it long enough and you find out that your solution either has been tried or and there had unintended problems with it. And then you find out, oh, then it's this solution. And now you become a fundamentalist about the second solution. And in my experience, very often where I end up or where I find myself is that I become a fundamentalist about 4 or 5 solutions. And then I realize, you know what, more important than the solution is me owning the problem, being open to a number of solutions, and deepening my desire for a better world and a better status. If I could offer one other little specific thing that doesn't really relate to the question, we're framed by capitalism. And so very often in capitalism, where money is the measure of all things, it seems, or in our kind of capitalism that's dominant now, the solution to all things is money. And I wonder if one of the challenges that we face is to say the whole system that has this obsession with money, that there is no lasting solution within this set of assumptions. And it's not as simple, I don't think, as substituting socialism for capitalism, because although that certainly has a lot to offer. But if you say socialism is a different way of organizing money, then we're still obsessed with money. And so one of those non-directive statements I'm trying to live with and repeat lately is that I think we human beings need a new relationship with money, our neighbors, and the environment and the earth, and a whole new value system. And that, to me, feels like part of the creative work. Now, that's not to shortcut all the short-term necessary conversations we have about race. When people are being killed by police, that's an emergency, and we need to try to stop that. And there are short-term solutions for that. Death penalty, all of these short-term solutions, we have to be able to do both. The short-term emergency actions, not losing the long-term bigger questions about what kind of value system we have and so on.
Yeah. And one thing for everyone in the group, not the next reading group, but the one after that, where I'm doing another class with Adam Clark, a Black theologian, and it's going to be looking at all the 6 big questions shaping Black theology after James Cone. And we'll have readings from different Black theologians, womanist theologians, and then different liberation theologians that have engaged American Black theology. And he's doing interviews with a lot of major voices, because after we processed our last class together, I said, I want to do a class where we hear the questions from your experience, not mine. And there's thousands of episodes of Tripp's theological interest, gauging, and interview. And then we picked the kind of like the outline of the class, and he picked the best text. And we're going to have a separate session of us reading the text together. Like how did I hear these texts? And then how does he hear them, coming from a different different background out of the Black church and that theological tradition, me growing up in, Baptist life, becoming a liberal mainline Protestant, that kind of thing. And then because it used the gift of friendship to have awkward theological conversations. And so we've been working on it a lot. And I just think Steve's question was a good example of what I hope happens. Like,
yes,
having the kinds of relationships, in the context of the body of the crucified one, that we then figure out how to do better together. And but y'all be on the lookout. It'd be in like November or December, sometime around then. And
thanks for doing that. That'll be so great.
Oh yeah. Well, thank you all for being here. Remember, you can respond to anything with questions or click the link and leave a voice one. Diana will be answering questions next, and then we'll be back around Tuesday. We will have next Tuesday, session 3. Tomorrow is there'll be a special stream. It'll be on the Homebrewed page and in the group with my friend Josh Morris, who did his PhD in theology at Claremont and is an Army chaplain who spent time in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we'll be talking about what it's like to think about moral injury in the war on terror as someone who chose, after being a youth minister, to clergy. I mean, he was clergy to youth whose parents are in war, chose to enter the military as a nonviolent Christian to be a chaplain, and then works with them and the trauma of coming home and what's that mean for us as Christians, people of faith. It's he's just one of the coolest people. And he's written a powerful book that had come out in like 2 weeks. And I messaged him and was like, some of you sent questions about how to deal with military people that come back in your congregation. And I'm like, I'm not doing that. I don't want to answer that question. And I have plenty of military in my family. Mm-hmm. So I texted Josh and he said he would talk about it. So
awesome.
Anyway, that's looking forward to that. Then next Tuesday, and then we'll have Q&A with Diana after that. So anything you think we need to make sure we mention?
Well, just that all of these things, there's always more to say, isn't there? We've had an hour and a half conversation, and on everything, there was so much more to say. But thank you, Tripp, for your helping create this space where people around the world are sitting in a car, or doing dishes, or taking a walk, and they're joining this important set of conversations.
Awesome. We'll see you next time.